a man who fixes machines, a woman who runs empires, and a bet that neither of them expected to change everything. When the lights died at Blackstone Energy 3 hours before the most important product launch in the company's history, every expert in that building threw up their hands. Every expert except one, a maintenance technician with grease on his knuckles and a robotics competition circled on his calendar. Victoria Langford didn't believe he could do it, so she made him an offer she never thought she'd have to honor. What happened next stunned an entire corporation and quietly broke open 2 lives that had been sealed shut for years. If this story has you already, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one is going to take a while, and every minute of it is worth it. The generator room sat 3 levels below the executive floor, and on most days nobody thought about it at all. That was the nature of infrastructure. The things that kept everything running were the things people noticed only when they stopped. The HVAC units that cycled air through 42 floors of glass and steel. The backup power conduits that ran like arteries beneath the polished concrete. The emergency generator that had been installed 11 years ago, tested quarterly, and trusted absolutely. Until the morning of October 14th, when it decided to die without warning, without ceremony, and at the single worst possible moment in the company's recent history. Ethan Holloway heard the alarm at 9:47 a.m. He was on the 18th floor at the time, replacing a faulty exhaust fan in the maintenance corridor behind the East Wing conference rooms. He had his earbuds in. One earbud, actually, because that was a habit he'd developed years ago, so he could still hear if someone called his name or if something mechanical started making a sound it shouldn't. The other earbud dangled against his chest. He was listening to a podcast about amateur robotics engineering, which his daughter had recommended with the kind of enthusiasm only a 12-year-old can produce, and he'd been half following it while his hands worked the fan housing. The alarm was not the building's fire alarm. It was the lower, steadier tone that meant something in the power infrastructure had tripped a failsafe. Ethan pulled out his one earbud, tilted his head, and listened. He knew the building's mechanical systems the way a musician knows their own instrument. He'd been working at Blackstone Energy's headquarters for 4 years, which wasn't long by some standards, but was long enough when you paid the kind of attention Ethan paid. He knew which elevator shafts rattled in high wind. He knew which section of the third-floor plumbing tended to develop air pockets after a hard freeze. He knew that the emergency generator on sub-level 2 had a slight vibration irregularity on cold starts, which the quarterly inspection reports had logged as within acceptable parameters 3 times in a row, and which he had privately believed was not within acceptable parameters at all, but nobody had asked him. He capped the fan housing, packed his tools, and headed for the stairs. By the time he reached sub-level 2, there were already 2 other people there, Marcus Webb, the facilities supervisor, and a younger technician named Derek, whose last name Ethan had never learned because Derek mostly kept headphones on and avoided conversation. Marcus was standing at the generator's main panel with a tablet in one hand and his phone pressed to his ear. He looked up when Ethan came through the door. "Tell me you've got something," Marcus said. Ethan looked at the generator. It was a large industrial unit. About the size of a freight container stood on its side, and it was currently dark and silent in a way that large industrial units should never be dark and silent. The panel indicators were all dead. The unit itself had an almost eerie stillness, like something had just left it. "When did it go?" Ethan asked. 9:44, full shutdown. No load fault, no surge, nothing. It just stopped. Marcus pulled the phone away from his ear long enough to say, "I've got the engineering team coming down, but they're saying 2, maybe 3 hours minimum to diagnose." Ethan set his tool bag on the ground and crouched down beside the base of the unit. 2 or 3 hours, he said, not as a question, just repeating it. "The launch is at 1, Marcus said. He didn't need to say more. Ethan knew about the launch. Everyone in the building knew about the launch. Blackstone Energy's new grid-scale battery platform, the Clear Grid system, had been in development for 4 years and was projected to shift the entire commercial energy storage market. The presentation was happening in the main auditorium on the 32nd floor, with investors, journalists, and industry analysts flying in from 7 countries. The CEO had apparently been preparing for this day since before Ethan had started working here. If we don't have backup power restored by noon, Marcus continued, lowering his voice even though it was just the three of them down there. The AV systems in the auditorium are running on the main grid, which is stable, but the demonstration equipment, the actual battery array, it runs on the isolated secondary circuit that feeds off the generator. No generator, no live demo, just slides. And slides won't cut it, Ethan said. Slides will definitely not cut it. Ethan put his hand flat against the casing near the base of the unit. He felt nothing unusual. No heat, no vibration, which in itself told him something. He moved along the side, running his fingers along the housing seams, not because he expected to feel anything, but because it helped him think. I need the maintenance log, he said. The physical one, not the tablet version, the one in the binder. Marcus looked at him for a second, then handed it over without comment. Ethan flipped through the last 8 months of entries. He found what he was looking for on the 4th page back, a note he himself had written in February, 3 lines in his own handwriting. Cold start vibration on initial cycle, 2 to 3 seconds. Governor valve. Possible debris accumulation. Recommend internal inspection. And below it, in different handwriting, the facilities manager's initials and a single word, monitored. Not repaired. Monitored. He put the binder down and looked at the generator with an expression that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite frustration. It was something in between, the look of a man who has been quietly right about something for a long time. Get me a floor lamp, he said, one of the ones from the storage room, and I'm going to need the unit's side access panel removed. Do you have the breaker key? The engineering team is supposed to handle Marcus. Ethan looked at him steadily. The engineering team will be here in 2 hours. The launch is in 3. That's not a lot of margin. Marcus held his gaze for a moment, then reached for the key ring on his belt. The executive floor got the news at 10:15 a.m. Victoria Langford was already in the boardroom when her assistant, Priya, knocked twice and opened the door. Victoria had been in the boardroom since 8, going through the final presentation deck with her head of product, Ryan Cho, and the 2 engineers who'd built the clear grid prototype. She was standing at the window when Priya came in, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched in 20 minutes, watching the gray October sky over the city. There's a situation with the generator, Priya said. Victoria turned. Define situation. It's offline. Full shutdown. The facilities team is working on it, but how long? Priya glanced at her tablet. Engineering is estimating 2 to 3 hours. The boardroom went quiet. Ryan Cho stopped clicking his pen. One of the engineers from the prototype team, a woman named Soo Jin Park, who had been reviewing data on her laptop, slowly closed the screen. 2 to 3 hours, Victoria said. The demo starts at 1. Yes. Victoria set down the coffee cup. She turned to Ryan. Can we run the demonstration array on anything else? A portable system, It's a grid-scale battery demonstration, Ryan said, not unkindly. The whole point is that it operates on commercial infrastructure. If we plug it into a portable generator, every analyst in that room will notice. They'll definitely notice, Soo-Jin added. Victoria nodded once. She was already thinking through the alternatives, running the decision tree she'd built over 12 years of corporate firefighting. Delay the launch, possible but damaging. Proceed without the live demo. The analyst would ask why. Someone would find out about the generator failure. It would become the story instead of the product. Reschedule entirely. Unacceptable. There were people on planes right now from Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo. Who's down there? She asked. The facilities supervisor and a couple of maintenance techs. The engineering team is being pulled from a site inspection across town. Get me the name of whoever's in charge of that generator room right now. Priya checked her phone. Marcus Webb is facilities supervisor. There's also a maintenance technician, Ethan Holloway. Victoria had never heard either name before. That wasn't unusual. Blackstone employed nearly 400 people in its headquarters building alone, and she wasn't in the habit of memorizing the maintenance roster. But she was in the habit of going directly to a problem when the problem was this size. I'm going down, she said. Ryan looked alarmed. Victoria, I'm not going to stand in a boardroom for 3 hours waiting for a status update. She was already at the door. The sublevel 2 generator room was not designed to receive the CEO of a $2 billion company. It smelled like machine oil and dry concrete. The lighting was fluorescent and unflattering. There was a metal utility shelf along one wall stacked with spare components, a small workbench bolted to the floor, and the generator itself, which occupied most of the space and currently had its side access panel removed, exposing a complex arrangement of components that Victoria couldn't immediately parse. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Marcus Webb saw her first and straightened up like a recruit who'd just heard a general walk in. "Miss Langford, what's the status?" Marcus began talking, something about the engineering team and diagnostic protocols and estimated timelines. And Victoria listened, but her attention kept drifting to the other person in the room. He was crouched beside the open access panel, not looking at her. He had a work lamp positioned to illuminate the interior of the unit, and he was examining something inside with the focused stillness of a man who had genuinely forgotten that other people existed. He was in maintenance coveralls, the gray ones with the Blackstone logo on the chest, and his hands were already darkened with oil up to the wrists. He had a piece of equipment in one hand that Victoria didn't recognize, and he was turning it slowly, methodically, like he was reading it. "Excuse me," Victoria said, addressing him directly. He looked up. He had dark eyes and a face that was neither remarkable nor forgettable. It was the kind of face that registered as trustworthy before you'd consciously decided anything about it. There was a small scar along his left jaw that she noticed and then immediately forgot about. "Ms. Langford," he said, and he didn't sound nervous, which was slightly unusual in her experience. Most people sounded at least a little nervous when she appeared unannounced in their workspace. "Do you know what's wrong with it?" she asked, nodding toward the generator. He looked back at the unit for a moment before answering. "I think so." "You think, or you know?" "I know what I believe, and I need about 20 more minutes to confirm it." He paused. "The governor valve assembly has debris accumulation. It's been building for months. It's blocking fuel regulation on cold starts. And this morning the temperature in the sublevel dropped enough to trigger a failure sequence. The unit tried to compensate, overloaded its own control relay, and shut down to prevent damage." Victoria glanced at Marcus, who gave a small, uncertain shrug that communicated he had no idea whether this was correct. "If that's what it is," Victoria said, "can you fix it?" "If that's what it is," Ethan said, "yes." "How long?" He appeared to do some calculation in his head. "Hour and a half. Maybe less." "The engineering team is estimating 2 to 3 hours just for diagnosis." "I know. And you're saying you can have it repaired in the same time they're claiming to need just to figure out what's wrong?" "I'm not competing with them," he said, with a mildness that wasn't defensive. "I've been looking at this unit for 4 years. I wrote a maintenance note in February flagging this exact component. It didn't get addressed, so I know what it is and I know how to fix it." Victoria studied him. She had a very well-developed ability to read people. It had gotten her through board meetings, hostile acquisitions, negotiations with partners who smiled while trying to take everything. She looked at this man and could not find the performance she was used to finding. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was just telling her what he believed to be true. That, in her world, was genuinely unusual. "If you fix this generator before 2 o'clock, she said, and she wasn't sure why she said it, except that something in his manner had irritated her slightly, some quality of unimpressed competence that she found both useful and, irrationally, faintly aggravating. "I'll walk into that launch presentation and kiss you in front of every person in the room." Marcus made a small sound. It wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a cough. Ethan looked at her steadily for a moment. His expression didn't change much. "And if I don't?" "You lose your job." She expected him to push back. She expected negotiation or offense, or at least some sign that he understood the asymmetry of what she'd just proposed. What she got instead was a pause. But it wasn't the pause of a man calculating odds. It was the pause of a man whose mind had briefly gone somewhere else. He looked at his watch. It was a plain, inexpensive thing with a face that showed date as well as time. October 14th. She wouldn't know until later what that date meant to him. "Okay," he said. He turned back to the generator. Marcus caught Victoria's eye with an expression that said, quite clearly, what just happened. She didn't have an answer for him. She turned and walked back toward the elevator, and she told herself she felt nothing unusual at all. Word traveled fast in a corporate building. By 11 o'clock, 3 different people had told Ryan Cho about the wager. By 11:30, there were at least 6 people who had found reasons to walk past the door of sublevel 2 and look through the small wire-reinforced window in the door. Ethan either didn't notice or didn't care. He worked without stopping, methodically, moving through the repair with a deliberateness that didn't look like speed but somehow accumulated into it. He had identified the problem exactly as he'd described it. The governor valve assembly, a component that regulated fuel flow during startup sequences, had accumulated debris from a slow contamination in the fuel line. The contamination itself came from a degraded gasket in the secondary filter housing, something that had been decaying for months and shedding microscopic particles into the system. On warm days, the debris stayed relatively dispersed. On cold mornings, when fuel viscosity increased and the system ran slower in its initial cycle, the particles clustered. This morning, the cluster had been enough to cause a partial blockage. The unit had thrown a fault code, tried to compensate with a higher ignition cycle, overloaded the control relay, and tripped the automatic safety shutdown. He'd seen variations of this exact failure twice before, in industrial facilities he'd worked at before Blackstone, once in a manufacturing plant in Ohio, once in a cold storage facility in western Pennsylvania. Both times, the solution had been the same: clean the valve assembly, replace the degraded gasket, reset the control relay, prime the fuel line. Nobody at Blackstone would have recognized this because nobody at Blackstone had spent 12 years doing field maintenance on industrial power equipment before they'd ever set foot in a corporate headquarters. Ethan had. He'd started doing maintenance work when he was 19, which was the year his plans for engineering school had fallen apart for financial reasons that would take him another decade to fully recover from. He'd worked in 3 different states, learned the systems from people who had no patience for theory and enormous patience for practice, and accumulated the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from certification courses or manuals. It comes from being in a room alone with a broken machine until you understand each other. He worked through the morning. Someone, he thought it was Marcus, left a coffee in a paper cup on the workbench beside him around 11:15. He drank about half of it. At 11:48, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. "Dad, Coach said we have to be there by 5:30 for setup. Are you still coming?" He looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, "I'll be there. Promise." He set the phone aside and kept working. The engineering team arrived at 12:10 p.m. There were 4 of them, senior engineers dispatched from the infrastructure division, carrying equipment cases and wearing the slightly harried expression of people who had been pulled off another job and rushed across the city. Their lead, a man named Gareth, who was heavy-set and had the air of someone accustomed to being the authority in a room, stopped short when he saw the state of the generator. The access panel was open. Components were arranged on a clean shop cloth on the workbench with the careful organization of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The valve assembly had been removed, cleaned, and was in the process of being reinstalled. The degraded gasket had already been replaced from a spare parts kit that Ethan had requisitioned from the storage shelf. A standard part, nothing exotic, the kind of thing a well-stocked maintenance room should have, and fortunately did. Gareth looked at Ethan. "Who authorized this?" "Marcus Webb, facilities supervisor." Ethan was tightening a fitting and didn't look up. This unit requires a certified infrastructure engineer for any internal maintenance. The certification requirement applies to full system overhauls and scheduled maintenance inspections, Ethan said. "What I'm doing is emergency corrective repair under the facility's emergency protocol. You can pull the policy document if you want. It's in the shared drive." Gareth looked at Marcus, who made the same uncertain shrug he'd been making all morning. "What did you find?" one of the other engineers asked, a younger man with a more genuinely curious expression than his senior colleague's defensive one. Ethan explained it: the valve debris, the gasket degradation, the cold temperature factor, the control relay trip. He explained it clearly, without condescension, but also without softening it. The younger engineer leaned in to look at the components on the workbench and nodded slowly. "The February maintenance note," the young engineer said. "I saw that in the log. We flagged it for the next scheduled inspection. It needed more than a flag, Ethan said. Fair, the young engineer said. Gareth hadn't moved from the doorway. He was doing the math, visibly. He'd come here to rescue a crisis, and the crisis was apparently already being handled by a facilities maintenance worker in coveralls, which was not the situation he'd prepared for. How long until it's back up? He asked, and the question was professional enough that Ethan answered it the same way. 20 minutes? Maybe 25. Upstairs, the atmosphere on the executive floor had become its own kind of tense. The launch auditorium on the 32nd floor was filling steadily. Blackstone's communications team was managing arrivals. The German Energy Consortium representatives, the analysts from 3 major investment houses, the journalists from 2 trade publications and 1 mainstream financial press outlet that had been covering Blackstone's battery development for a year. The catering had been set up. The AV check had been completed on all the presentation equipment that ran off the main grid. The one thing that hadn't been confirmed was the backup generator. Ryan Cho had been getting updates from Marcus Webb every 20 minutes. He'd passed each one to Victoria, who received them with an expression that gave nothing away. She had returned to the boardroom after her visit to Sublevel 2 and had continued working through the presentation preparation with the same focus she always brought to things, which was the kind of focus that worked equally well as a wall between herself and whatever she didn't want to think about. At 12:55 p.m., Ryan's phone buzzed. He read the message. He looked up at Victoria. "Generator's back online," he said. "Full capacity. The clear grid array is running on isolated secondary power." He paused. "It's been running for 11 minutes already. Stable." Victoria looked at him for a moment without expression. "Who confirmed it?" she asked. "Gareth's team. They oversaw the final reconnection." Ryan hesitated. "Apparently the maintenance tech had it repaired before they arrived." "Before they arrived?" "Yeah." Victoria looked back at her notes. "Good," she said. "We're on schedule." Ryan was watching her with the careful attention of someone who'd worked alongside her for 5 years and knew when she was processing something she wasn't saying out loud. "So," he said carefully, "about the wager." "What about it?" "It's 12:57. You said before 2. "I know what I said." "The whole building knows what you said." Victoria put down her pen. She looked at Ryan with a directness that he was used to, but which never entirely stopped being a little intimidating. "Are you asking me if I'm going to do it?" "I'm your head of product," Ryan said. "I'm not asking you anything. I'm just making sure you're aware that there are approximately 65 people currently in the launch auditorium who have somehow all heard about a wager involving their CEO and a maintenance technician." Victoria stood up. She smoothed her jacket. She picked up her presentation notes. "Let's go," she said. But the 32nd floor auditorium held about 120 people when full, and on the afternoon of October 14th, it held 117. The room had a slight downward slope toward the front, like a theater, with rows of cushioned chairs facing a raised presentation stage. At the back of the stage was a large display screen, and beside it, behind a low barrier of transparent panels, was the clear grid demonstration array, a compact arrangement of modular battery units about the size of 2 refrigerators side by side, currently powered up and running on the restored secondary circuit, their status indicators glowing a steady, quiet green. Ethan stood in the back corner. He'd cleaned up, washed his hands and face in the sub-level maintenance sink, changed out of the worst of the oil-stained coveralls into his backup pair, which he kept in his locker out of a long-standing professional habit. He wasn't sure why he'd come up here. He could have gone to the break room and waited for the end of the workday. He could have gone back to the 18th floor and finished the exhaust fan installation. He had a performance review scheduled for next week that he probably should have been thinking about. He'd come up because Marcus had told him to. "You should be there when it starts," Marcus had said, with an expression that suggested he was operating under some professional obligation he couldn't fully articulate. "Just be there." So he was there, in the back corner, trying to be invisible, which was something he was actually reasonably good at in rooms like this. He watched the room fill. He watched the analysts and investors settle into their seats with the measured casualness of people who were trained not to look too eager. He watched the Blackstone communications team circulate with the kind of quiet efficiency that clearly cost a lot of money to maintain. He looked at the clear grid array behind its transparent barrier and felt quietly something he didn't have a specific name for. A small, clean satisfaction at seeing those green indicator lights running steady. He checked his watch. 1:09 p.m. He had a robotics competition to get to. When Victoria Langford walked out onto the stage, the room shifted in that particular way that rooms shift when someone with real authority enters them. Not a hush, exactly, but a kind of settling, like a collective exhalation. She was taller than she'd seemed in the generator room, or maybe it was the stage, or maybe it was the suit, which was dark and precise in a way that made every other garment in the room look approximate. She walked to the podium without acknowledging the room, set down her notes, and looked up. She found him. He didn't know how, in a room of 117 people, she'd located the one person standing in the back corner before she'd said a single word. But she had. They held each other's gaze for 2 seconds, long enough to register, not long enough to mean anything defined. Then she looked back at the room. "Good afternoon," she said. "Thank you for being here." She began. Ethan had heard the broad strokes of the clear grid pitch before. You couldn't work in the building and avoid it entirely. But he hadn't heard Victoria Langford present it. She was, he realized within the first 5 minutes, genuinely good at this. Not in the polished, rehearsed way he'd expected from the brief interaction in the generator room, but in a way that had actual thinking behind it. She didn't just describe what the battery system did, she described why it mattered, and she did it with a specificity that suggested she understood the technology at a level beyond boardroom comprehension. When she brought up the live demonstration, the point at which the clear grid array would run an actual load cycle in real time, in front of the room, she paused for a fraction of a second before she triggered it. And in that fraction of a second, Ethan understood she was thinking about the generator, about the fact that the green lights on that array were green because of what had happened in sublevel 2 that morning. She triggered the demonstration. The array responded perfectly. The room made the sound that rooms make when they see something work. She waited for it to settle. Then she said, without changing her tone, "Before I take your questions, I want to acknowledge something." The room quieted. "This morning, 3 hours before this presentation, our emergency generator failed. Every certified engineer I could reach estimated 2 to 3 hours to diagnose the problem. A facilities maintenance technician named Ethan Holloway diagnosed it in under 30 minutes and repaired it in just over an hour." She looked toward the back of the room, toward the corner. "Mr. Holloway is in the room. I made him a fairly ridiculous wager this morning, that if he fixed the generator before 2 o'clock, I would walk across this stage and kiss him in front of everyone in this room." The room made a different kind of sound. "I keep my commitments," Victoria said. She stepped off the stage. Ethan didn't move. Part of him, the part that had been in enough uncomfortable situations to develop decent early warning systems, had suspected this moment was coming, had spent the entire presentation half preparing for it, and had still somehow managed not to fully prepare. The room had turned. 117 pairs of eyes were on the back corner. 117 people watching to see what happened next. She walked the length of the aisle with the same steadiness she'd walked to the podium. Up close, he could see that she was slightly less composed than she'd appeared on stage. Not much. It was subtle, a quality of attention in her expression that hadn't been there before, or that the distance had hidden. She stopped in front of him. "You're in the back corner," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear her. "I didn't want to be in the way," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then, with the precise and deliberate manner of a person honoring a commitment they had not fully thought through, she leaned forward and kissed him on the cheek. It was brief. It was formal, even the kind of gesture that was just barely on the warm side of a professional acknowledgement. And yet something about it landed in the room differently than anyone, including her, seemed to have anticipated. There was a silence first. Then someone started clapping, and the room decided that was the appropriate response, and the applause built. Victoria straightened. Her expression was controlled, but he was close enough to see that her jaw was slightly set in the way of someone who has just done something they can't immediately categorize. "Well done this morning," she said. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze for 1 moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned and walked back to the stage, and the room settled, and the Q&A session began, and Ethan Holloway quietly picked up his tool bag, slipped out the side door, and went to collect his daughter. The city was doing what October cities do in the early evening, the light going amber and sideways, the air carrying the first real edge of cold. Ethan drove a 10-year-old pickup truck that had a heater that worked perfectly and a radio that worked intermittently, and he drove across town with the heater running and the radio silent, thinking about the generator and the governor valve and the look on Gareth's face when he'd arrived to find the repair already half done. He thought about those things so he wouldn't think about the other thing, the auditorium, the back corner, the fraction of a second before she'd said his name in front of all those people, when he'd had the distinct and disorienting sensation of being seen in a room where he'd specifically arranged not to be seen. He pulled into the parking lot of the Westfield Community Center at 5:24 p.m. His daughter was standing outside the front doors with her robotics kit and a look that was simultaneously the most impatient look he had ever seen and somehow also relieved. "You're late," Mia said. "I'm 6 minutes early," he said. The coach said 5:30. "It's 5:24. She looked at him with the precise expression she'd inherited from nobody he could identify. This narrow-eyed, "you're technically correct, but you know what I mean" look. She was 12, and she had recently started doing this thing where she processed every statement he made for internal inconsistencies before responding to it. He found it both slightly exhausting and privately delightful. "You got oil on your collar," she said. He looked down. She was right. He'd missed a spot. "It was a complicated morning," he said. She handed him her robotics kit so she could retie her left shoe. "Did you fix the thing?" she asked, the way she always asked about his work, casually, factually, as if she assumed competence as a baseline and was only asking for procedural detail. "I fixed it," he said. "Was it the governor valve?" He looked at her. "How did you You said in February that the governor valve had debris accumulation and you were worried about cold start failures," she said, still working on her shoe. "I remembered because I looked up what a governor valve was." He stood in the parking lot of the Westfield Community Center with his daughter's robotics kit under his arm and thought about that for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It was the governor valve." She finished with her shoe and stood up and held out her hand for the kit. He gave it back to her. They walked toward the front doors. "The CEO made a bet with me this morning," he said, because he wasn't sure why he was telling her this but found he wanted to. Mia looked at him sideways. "What kind of bet?" "If I fixed the generator before 2 o'clock, she said she'd kiss me in front of everyone at the company launch." Mia's expression underwent a very complex series of transformations in a very short period of time. "Did she?" "She did." "Like, actually?" "On the cheek." Mia was quiet for a moment as they reached the door. "That's kind of weird," she said. "It was a bit weird," he agreed. She pulled open the door. Then she stopped and looked back at him with an expression that was different. Not the narrow-eyed assessor look, something a little more open. "But you fixed it," she said. "Before 2 o'clock." "Before 2 o'clock," he said. She nodded once, satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with CEOs or wagers or auditoriums. She was satisfied because he had done what he said he'd do, and that was the metric by which she'd always measured everything, and he had always known that, and he had always tried to be worth it. They went inside together. The Westfield Community Center's gymnasium had been converted into a competition space. Rows of folding tables, numbered competition stations, the sound of motors and servos and 12-year-olds being extremely serious about things. Mia found her team immediately and slipped into the organized chaos of pre-competition setup with the ease of someone who belonged there. Ethan found a seat in the bleachers and sat down. He was tired. He'd been awake since 5:30. He'd done 3 hours of intense repair work. He'd stood in an auditorium in the back corner and been kissed on the cheek by his CEO in front of analysts from Frankfurt and Tokyo. And he was sitting in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and motor oil and a very particular kind of 12-year-old determination. He put his elbows on his knees and watched his daughter calibrate her robot sensor array with a focus that reminded him, painfully and warmly, of himself in a generator room 3 levels underground. She didn't know it yet. She had no way of knowing it, But watching her work, he thought about what he'd said to Marcus months ago, writing that note about the governor valve. Recommend internal inspection. He'd known what the problem was. He'd known it would matter eventually. He'd just needed the right conditions for it to become visible. He was starting to think that might be true of more than generators. He didn't know what to make of Victoria Langford. He didn't know what to make of a CEO who came down to a sub-level maintenance room and proposed impossible wagers and kept them in front of 117 people. He didn't know what to make of a woman who could present a technical product launch with genuine fluency and then walk the length of an auditorium aisle in front of every investor in the building to honor a bet she'd made impulsively. He knew this. There had been a moment in the back corner when she'd said, "Well done this morning," and the look on her face had not been the look of someone performing a public gesture. It had been the look of someone who had expected one thing and encountered something else entirely and was still in the process of figuring out what that meant. He recognized the look. He'd had it himself that morning when he'd looked at the generator and understood precisely what had gone wrong and why. Sometimes the problem was simpler than everyone assumed. Sometimes it had been sitting right there for months, waiting for someone to pay the right kind of attention. He wasn't sure which of them the metaphor applied to. On the gymnasium floor, Mia's robot crossed the first test course without a single error. She didn't look up to see if he was watching. She already knew he was. He was always watching. Mia's robot won. Not by a large margin. Second place had been close enough that the judges had to review the run twice. But she won, and she accepted the small trophy with the same focused composure she brought to everything, thanking her teammates before she thanked the judges, which was not something the competition rules required, but was something she apparently believed was correct. Ethan watched from the bleachers and said nothing about it, because some things don't need commentary. They stopped for burgers on the way home. It was a place they went maybe once a month, a diner with red vinyl stools and a menu that hadn't changed in at least a decade. And Mia talked the entire time about the competition with the kind of post-event energy that needed somewhere to go. She explained in technical detail why the other team's sensor calibration had cost them time on the second obstacle. She talked about a modification she wanted to make to the drive system before the regional qualifier in January. She ate half her burger and all her fries without appearing to notice either, because her attention was entirely elsewhere. Ethan listened. He asked questions when she paused. He ate his food and drank his coffee and thought, distantly, that this was the best part of any day. Not fixing something, not getting it right under pressure, but sitting across a sticky diner table from his daughter while she explained things to him with the assumption that he could follow along. They got home a little after 9. Mia went to shower and then appeared in the doorway of his room in pajamas to say goodnight, holding her new trophy in one hand with the casualness of someone who had already mentally moved on to the next problem. "Good day," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Good day." She went to bed. He sat on the edge of his own bed for a while, looking at nothing in particular, and eventually lay down without changing clothes and stared at the ceiling until his mind finally slowed down enough to sleep. He did not think about Victoria Langford, or he tried not to, which is a different thing, and not always successful. The next morning at Blackstone was different. Not dramatically. Nothing had changed in the physical layout of the building. The maintenance schedule was the same. The fluorescent lights in the sub-level corridors buzzed with the same persistent frequency they always had. But the air was different in the way air gets in a place where something unexpected has happened, and everyone is still deciding what it means. People looked at Ethan differently. He noticed it first in the elevator. A junior analyst from the 4th floor who'd clearly been at the launch got on at the lobby, and when he recognized Ethan, made a small fractional adjustment in posture that was almost like deference. Then Marcus told him, with a slightly strained professionalism, that there had been 3 separate requests from different department heads asking that Ethan be assigned to their floor's maintenance rotations. And Derek, the perpetually headphone technician who had barely acknowledged Ethan's existence in 4 years of working the same building, actually said good morning, with eye contact. Ethan found all of it mildly uncomfortable. He was doing a routine inspection of the 3rd floor HVAC junction when his work phone rang with an extension he didn't immediately recognize. He answered it. "Mr. Holloway." It was Priya, Victoria's assistant, with the precise professional tone of someone managing a complicated calendar. "Ms. Langford would like to meet with you at 11 o'clock. if you're available. Her office, 34th floor. He was crouched inside a ceiling access panel at the time, half his body in the ductwork, and he held the phone to his ear and thought about that for a moment. I can do 11, he said. He arrived at the 34th floor at 10:58. The executive floor was a different country from everywhere else in the building, quieter in a way that felt deliberate, the carpet deeper, the air carrying a faint smell of expensive coffee and printer toner. Priya directed him to a seating area and brought him water he didn't ask for. He sat in a low chair that was probably worth more than his truck and waited. Victoria came out of her office at 11:03. She was carrying a folder and a coffee cup, and she looked, if anything, like she'd been at work for 5 hours already, which she probably had. Come in, she said, not stopping. Her office was large without being ostentatious. She had a desk and a conference table and 2 walls of windows overlooking the city, and the desk had the comfortable disorder of someone who actually used it, rather than using it as a display surface. There were engineering diagrams pinned to one wall that she clearly referred to regularly, the corners softened from being handled. Ethan noticed these because they were the first thing in the room that told him something true about her. She sat down behind the desk. He took the chair across from it. I want to talk about what happened yesterday, she said. Okay. The wager was inappropriate. She said it without excessive weight. Not an apology exactly, but a statement of fact she'd clearly arrived at through deliberate consideration. I put you in a position where refusing would have looked like an admission of failure in front of your supervisor, and I used your employment as leverage. That's not something I should have done. Ethan looked at her. I accepted it. I know you did. Nobody made me. I know that too. She set the folder down. I'm not withdrawing the acknowledgement. You saved a launch that matters a great deal to this company, and you did it with a problem that should have been addressed months ago, which is a failure on the part of this organization and not on yours. She paused. There's a formal commendation being added to your personnel file, and I've asked HR to prepare a performance bonus. You'll receive the paperwork this week. He didn't say anything for a moment. You came down to the generator room yourself, he said. Most CEOs wouldn't do that. She looked at him with the slight sharpness of someone assessing whether a statement is leading somewhere. I don't like waiting for filtered information when the original source is accessible. Neither do I, he said. Something in the air shifted, very slightly, in the way of a room where 2 people have unexpectedly recognized something in each other. Victoria noticed it. She looked down at the folder, not obviously, but he caught it. A small, deliberate redirection of attention. That's all I needed to say, she said. He stood. Thank you. He was almost at the door when she said, Your daughter competed last night. He stopped, turned back. I heard you mention it, she said, before he could ask. In the generator room, you said you'd promised her. He looked at her for a moment. She won. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something around her eyes did, some small and almost involuntary softening. Of course she did, she said, and it wasn't performance. It was just what came out. He nodded once. Then he left. But he thought about that exchange for the rest of the day with more frequency than he'd have preferred. Specifically, the last part, the way she'd said, of course she did, as if the outcome had been implied by something she'd observed, something about the way he'd talked about leaving for a robotics competition in the middle of a corporate crisis. He turned the 3 words over the way you turn something small and oddly weighted, trying to figure out what it's made of. He didn't come up with a satisfying answer. He put it away and went back to the exhaust fan on the 18th floor that he still hadn't finished. It was Ryan Cho who told him, indirectly and without meaning to, a week later. Ethan was servicing a climate control unit in the corridor outside the product development suite when Ryan came out of a meeting looking distracted and nearly walked into him. Ryan stopped, apologized, and then, with the slightly awkward recognition of someone who knows who you are and isn't sure what conversational register to use, said, The generator held up through the entire post-launch testing cycle, by the way. 3 weeks of load trials. Gareth's team said the repair work was solid. Good, Ethan said. Victoria mentioned it in the operations review. Ryan paused, the way people pause when they've said slightly more than they intended. She keeps tabs on things that matter to the building infrastructure. More than most people expect. Ethan kept his hands on the control unit, but glanced at Ryan. How long has she been running the company? 4 years, give or take. She took over from her father when he stepped back from day-to-day operations. Ryan's tone had a particular quality. Careful, measured, the tone of a man choosing words in a minefield he knew well. It wasn't a simple transition. Rarely is, Ethan said. Ryan seemed to decide that was a natural endpoint for the conversation and walked on, but the word he'd used stuck: father. Ethan turned it over alongside the rest of it, building an incomplete picture with incomplete pieces the way you sometimes have to before the clear view arrives. The second time he had a real conversation with Victoria Langford, it happened by accident. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the launch. Ethan was running late on a routine check of the server room cooling systems on the 33rd floor, a job that should have taken 2 hours but had stretched to nearly 4 because one of the cooling units had developed an ice-over problem that took time to clear correctly. He was finishing up the documentation at a standing terminal in the corridor when he heard footsteps that were too measured to be anyone except someone who'd been walking corporate hallways long enough to walk like they owned them. Victoria came around the corner and stopped when she saw him. "You're here late," she said. "Cooling unit on 33, he said. "Ice over. I didn't want to leave it." She looked at the terminal, then at him. She had her suit jacket over one arm. It was past 7 o'clock, and even the executive floor had mostly cleared out. Without the jacket, she looked marginally more like a person and marginally less like a corporate apparatus. "Ice over," she said. "Is that a—" The evaporator coil gets ice buildup when the refrigerant level drops below the operating threshold. It blocks airflow. The server room temperature starts rising before anyone notices it from the outside. He paused. "The refrigerant in that unit has been low for about 2 months. I flagged it in the maintenance request system." She looked at him steadily. "And it didn't get addressed." "It got scheduled," he said. "Scheduling and addressing are different things." She was quiet for a moment. "You flag a lot of things that don't get addressed. It's a big building." "That's not an excuse I'm particularly satisfied with." He looked at her directly. "Neither am I." She set her jacket over the edge of the terminal counter. "Show me the system," she said. He blinked. "The maintenance request system?" "Yes. It's internal software. Facilities management uses it. I know what it is. I approve the procurement." She looked at the terminal. "Log in." He logged in. She stood beside him, not hovering, not performing interest, just looking at the screen with the same direct attention she'd brought to everything he'd seen her engage with. He pulled up the current open requests and she scanned the list without speaking. He could tell the moment she was reading because her eyes stopped moving. 47 open items, she said. 49, after tonight. How many of these have been sitting for more than 30 days? He filtered the list. 22. More than 60 days? 11. She was quiet for longer this time. He didn't fill the silence. He'd learned in approximately 2.5 encounters that silence didn't make Victoria Langford uncomfortable enough to fill it with noise. She used silence the way most people use punctuation, to organize what came before and after. "Send me the full report," she said. "All open items, time in queue, priority classification, assigned status." "I can do that. Tonight." "All right." She picked up her jacket. She started to leave, then stopped with her back still partly to him. The kind of stop that looks like a thought that caught up with someone. "Do you always stay this late?" she asked. "When something needs finishing," he said. She turned back just enough to look at him. "Do you have someone? Is there someone at home with your daughter?" The question was quiet and genuinely uncertain, like she'd been unsure whether to ask it. He noted that. "She's old enough to be home alone for a few hours," he said. "She texts me if she needs anything." He paused. "She mostly texts me to tell me what's wrong with the dinner I left in the fridge." Something crossed Victoria's face that was very close to a smile, though it didn't quite commit to the name. "What was wrong with it tonight?" She said the chicken was, he checked his phone, quote, "technically edible." This time it was a real smile. Brief, but real. It changed her face considerably. "She sounds like a precise thinker," Victoria said. "She really is," he said. And the way he said it, the simple, undefended warmth of it, was apparently enough to make Victoria Langford look away first. She left. He finished the documentation and sent her the maintenance report from the terminal at 7:42 p.m. She replied at 7:58 with 3 lines. Reviewed. I'll have this escalated to operations by morning. Thank you for the information. He read it standing in the corridor with his coat on, ready to leave. He typed back, You're welcome. Then he went home. Mia was at the kitchen table when he got in, laptop open, geometry homework spread around her in a radius that suggested she'd been there for a while. Technically edible, he said, hanging his coat. The chicken needed more salt, she said, without looking up. I left a note on the salt shaker. You wrote, consider salt. That's a suggestion, not instructions. She turned a page in her textbook. How was work? He sat down at the table across from her. Interesting. She looked up at that. Mia had a finely tuned sensor for the difference between interesting as a filler word and interesting as an actual observation. The generator lady again? He looked at her. I didn't say anything about... You have a specific face, she said, and returned to her homework with the tone of someone who has made a sufficient point. He made himself tea. He sat back down. He watched her work through a problem about supplementary angles and thought about what Ryan Cho had said. She took over from her father when he stepped back. And about the engineering diagrams pinned to Victoria's office wall, worn at the corners. He thought about a woman who came down to a sub-level generator room herself, who stood beside a maintenance terminal at 7 in the evening and looked at a list of deferred repairs with an expression that wasn't performed outrage but genuine reckoning. He thought about the way she'd asked about Mia. Is there someone at home with your daughter? The slight hesitation in it, like she'd been running through the scenario of his evening in her head, and the question had arrived somewhere unexpected. Dad? Mia said. Yeah. You're thinking loud again. He looked at her. Can you hear thinking? I can hear you not talking, she said, which is the same thing. She closed her textbook with the authority of someone who had finished what she needed from it. You like her? She's my employer. That's not what I said. Mia. I'm not saying it's a problem, she said, with the infuriating reasonableness of a 12-year-old who has decided to be magnanimous. I'm just saying what I observe. He looked at her for a long moment. He started, and then stopped, because he didn't have a sentence that completed honestly without also proving her point. Mia waited. She's not what I expected, he finally said. Nobody interesting ever is, Mia said. She stood up and collected her homework into a pile that was not quite as organized as her robotics equipment, but was organized by her standards, which were their own system. Good night. Good night. She paused in the doorway. Also, if you want to make the chicken better, it's the sear. You're not getting enough color on it. She disappeared before he could respond. He sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. The apartment was quiet, in the way of a space that has contained a day's worth of noise and is now catching its breath. The maintenance report made an impact he hadn't anticipated. By end of week, 3 of the 11 items that had been sitting more than 60 days were resolved. A plumber was scheduled for the slow drain in the second-floor women's restroom that had been logged since August. The faulty ballast in the stairwell lighting on floors 9 through 11, which had been creating a low-level flicker that Ethan had always thought must be migraine-inducing, was replaced. The operations director, a man named Clifford Ames, who had always treated facilities maintenance with the benign inattention of someone who considered plumbing someone else's department, sent Marcus Webb a pointed memo about response times. Marcus told Ethan about the memo with an expression that mixed gratitude and bewilderment in roughly equal portions. She actually read the whole report? Marcus asked. Apparently, Ethan said, and escalated it herself. That's what it looks like. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was a methodical man, not prone to dramatic interpretation of events. And Ethan could see him trying to fit this development into a framework that made organizational sense. In 4 years, I've never had direct communication from the CEO's office about maintenance backlog. It's a lot of deferred work, Ethan said. The building's been like this since before I started, Marcus said, which wasn't a defense, just a fact, and they both knew it. Ethan didn't have an explanation that was cleaner than the one he'd already formed, which was this. Victoria Langford paid attention to things that were broken. And whatever had shifted in her attention after October 14th, it had widened her field of view in some way that now included deferred work orders on the 18th floor and ice-over conditions in server room cooling units. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He filed it under things to think about later and kept working. The call from her office came on a Friday afternoon, 4 days before Thanksgiving. Not Priya this time. It was Victoria herself calling his work cell directly with no preamble. "I'm looking at the engineering drawings for the secondary power circuit on floors 20 through 26, she said. "There's a junction specification I don't understand. Are you familiar with that section?" He thought about it. Somewhat. It was part of a partial upgrade done about 3 years ago. The documentation has some gaps. "Can you come up?" He was on the 14th floor with a replacement motor for a ventilation unit. "Give me 20 minutes. "Fine." He gave her 25. When he got to the 34th floor, she was at the conference table in her office, with architectural drawings spread across half the surface, and she'd pushed a second chair to the near side of the table in a way that was clear enough that he sat in it without being told. They worked through the circuit specifications for 90 minutes. It was a genuine problem. The documentation from the partial upgrade was incomplete in a way that created real uncertainty about load tolerance in 2 junction boxes. And the gap mattered because Victoria was evaluating an equipment upgrade for those floors and needed to know what the existing infrastructure could support. Ethan had worked with those junction boxes directly. He knew where the documentation ended, and his own observation began. They went back and forth. She pushed back when she disagreed, which she did twice, and both times he reconsidered his position before he responded. The first time he held his original answer. The second time he conceded she was right, because she was. At some point, Marcus texted him asking where he was, and he replied saying he was consulting on a technical review. Marcus sent back a thumbs up. At some other point, Victoria's coffee went cold, and she pushed it aside without noticing and kept reading drawings. At 5:45 p.m., she sat back in her chair and rubbed the side of her neck with one hand, a small human gesture that seemed to surprise her slightly when she became aware she was doing it. She stopped. "The load tolerance on Junction 4 is the limiting factor," she said. "Yes." "Which means the upgrade as currently spec'd won't work." "Not without reinforcing the junction box housing and upgrading the breaker capacity." She looked at the drawing for another moment. "Is that a significant job?" 3 days of work, not cheap, but not unreasonable." She nodded. "I'll have the engineering team revise the spec." She looked at him. "Thank you. This would have been a problem if we'd moved forward without catching it." "That's why you look at drawings before you buy equipment," he said. She looked at him with a slight tilt of her head. "You say things directly." "Usually. Most people don't around here. Not to me." He considered how to respond to that. "Does that bother you, or do you count on it?" The question landed differently than he'd expected. He could see it. She was quiet for a moment, and he had the distinct impression that nobody had asked her that, or at least not in a while. "Both," she said, "depending on the day." He nodded at that. He started rolling the drawings back toward their case, and she helped without making a thing of it, straightening the edges. Their hands were close together at one point over the drawings, and neither of them moved away. But neither of them made anything of it either. It was the kind of proximity that just is what it is, and both of them were apparently capable of letting it be that. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "With the company. You haven't applied for the engineering review positions I know Marcus has flagged as available." He looked at her. "No." "Why not?" It was a fair question and it deserved a real answer, so he thought about it honestly before speaking. "My daughter starts high school in 2 years," he said. "Her robotics program is here. Her school is good. Her team is good. Everything that matters to her is stable, and stable costs something to maintain." He paused. "A promotion with different hours and higher stakes problems doesn't give her more of me. It gives her less of me, with better pay. I've run that math before." Victoria was watching him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one that was not quite agreement and not quite something else, the one that appeared when he said something she hadn't expected. "You gave up an engineering career," she said. "I changed what I was building," he said. "That's different." She looked at him for one moment longer than she meant to. He saw her catch herself and look away. toward the window and the city and its late afternoon arrangement of lights. "My driver's downstairs," she said, and the shift in register was a slight but deliberate closing of something. She gathered her jacket from the back of her chair. He picked up his tool bag. They walked out to the corridor together. At the elevator, she pressed the button, and he pressed the button for the floor below, the parking access level. And they waited in the particular silence of people who have been talking for 90 minutes and have run out of specific things to say, but haven't run out of the conversation itself. The elevator came. They got on. "Your daughter," Victoria said as the doors closed. "The regional qualifier is when?" He looked at her. "January. How did you mentioned it. In the generator room. She was going to the regional qualifier in January." She looked at the floor indicator. "You mentioned it the way people mention things that are actually the main point." The doors opened at the parking level. He stepped out. He looked back at her once. "January 14th, he said. She nodded, just once. The doors closed. He stood in the parking level for a moment after the elevator was gone, with his tool bag over his shoulder and the particular quality of a Friday evening around him. The building going quiet, the work week folding itself up, the city already making its weekend sounds in the distance. He thought about a woman who remembered a detail from a conversation about a generator valve, who stayed past 7 to read maintenance reports, who pushed back twice during a technical review and was right once. He thought about engineering diagrams pinned with worn corners, and a smile that had arrived and departed so quickly he'd almost missed it, and 3 words spoken in a launch auditorium with more precision than they'd needed to have. Of course she did. He walked to his truck. He started the engine. He pulled out of the parking structure into the Friday evening and drove toward home, toward his daughter's critique of whatever he was about to cook, toward the quiet and reliable texture of a life he had built with his hands and intended to keep. But something was shifting in the machinery of things, quietly, the way shifts always begin, not with a loud fault alarm, but with a vibration that has always been there, waiting for the right conditions to become impossible to ignore. January 14th came with 6 inches of snow and a gymnasium full of nervous parents. Ethan arrived early enough to help the team unload equipment, which was not required of him, but which Mia had not discouraged, which in her language meant she wanted him there. The Westfield Regional Qualifier was the largest competition she'd entered, 12 teams from 4 different districts, with the top 2 advancing to the state championship in March. Mia's team had spent 11 weeks preparing, and the preparation showed in the way they moved through setup. No wasted motion, no arguments about who did what, the easy coordination of people who have practiced together long enough to stop explaining themselves. He found a seat in the bleachers and settled in. Victoria Langford walked through the gymnasium door at 10:23 a.m. He saw her before she saw him, which gave him approximately 3 seconds to process the fact that she had actually come. She was not dressed for a corporate function. Dark coat, scarf, hair not quite as contained as it usually was, which told him she had come the way a person comes to something rather than the way a professional comes to an event. She was scanning the bleachers with the focused uncertainty of someone in an unfamiliar space, and when she found him, she walked toward him without hesitation, which was characteristic. She sat down beside him, a seat away, not directly beside, a reasonable distance that acknowledged the strangeness of her being there without making a performance of it. "You came," he said. "I said I'd come." She looked at the competition floor. "Which one is her team?" "Table 6. Blue banner." Victoria found it. Mia was at the table with her team, running a final calibration on the drive system, talking to her teammate without looking up. "She looks like you," Victoria said. "Everyone says that and she hates it. Why?" "Because she thinks she looks like herself." He paused. "Which is fair." Victoria was quiet, watching the floor. She had her hands in her coat pockets, and she was sitting with a particular stillness. Not uncomfortable stillness, just the stillness of someone who had arrived somewhere and was allowing themselves to actually be there, which was apparently not something Victoria Langford did frequently. The competition began at 10:30. It ran in 2 rounds with a break between, and the gymnasium was loud in the particular way gymnasiums get loud when there are children performing and adults invested in the outcome. Ethan watched Mia's team with the divided attention of a man who had seen enough of her competitions to know when to worry and when to breathe. Victoria watched with something closer to undivided attention, and several times he caught her leaning forward slightly when a run was close. During the break between rounds, Mia came up to the bleachers for water. She saw Victoria and stopped. The pause lasted maybe 2 seconds. Mia's expression cycled through recognition. She knew who Victoria was, she'd heard the name enough, and then through something that was assessment rather than judgment. She looked at her father once, briefly, then back at Victoria. "You're the generator lady," Mia said. Victoria blinked. It was the closest thing to being caught off guard that Ethan had seen from her. Yes, in a sense. My dad said you're good at reading engineering drawings." He said that? He also said you were wrong about the junction load tolerance and then right about it. Ethan looked at the gymnasium ceiling. Both of those things happened, Victoria said, with the careful tone of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. "You're Mia." "Yeah." Mia drank her water. She was looking at Victoria with the particular evaluating attention she usually reserved for robotics components she wasn't sure she trusted. "Why did you come?" "Your father mentioned the competition, January 14th. He tells you things." "Sometimes." Mia appeared to process this. She finished her water, crumpled the cup with one hand, and looked back at her table where her team was reassembling. "Okay," she said, which was not agreement or disagreement, just the sound of information being filed. She climbed back down to the floor. Victoria turned to look at Ethan with an expression that was somewhere between amused and slightly shaken. "I know," he said. "Does she do that to everyone?" "Only people she's deciding about." "And what does it mean that she said okay?" He thought about that. "It means you're still under review, but you're not disqualified." Victoria looked back at the competition floor, and the smile that crossed her face this time was slower and more unguarded than any he'd seen from her before. Mia's team won the first round by a comfortable margin and the second by a narrower one. When the final scores were posted and the qualifying teams were announced, Mia reacted the way she always reacted to winning, a single nod, as if confirming a hypothesis, and then immediately started talking to her teammates about what they needed to fix before March. Ethan and Victoria walked out to the parking lot together, in the way people who have spent 3 hours sitting near each other naturally leave together without having decided to. The snow had stopped, but the cold had deepened, and their breath made small clouds in the air between them. "Thank you for coming," he said at his truck. "I wanted to." She said it without the slight hesitation that usually preceded things she was deciding whether to admit. "She's remarkable, the way she focuses." "She's always been like that, since she was small." Victoria was looking at the gymnasium entrance where other families were streaming out, kids carrying equipment cases and talking over each other. "Her mother," she said, and then stopped. "You looked me up," he said, not as an accusation. "There's a personnel file." She looked at him. "I don't usually read maintenance personnel files. I read yours." He was quiet for a moment. The cold was steady and the parking lot was loud with families, and he stood in the middle of it and thought about what it meant that she'd said that out loud. "She left when Mia was 3, he said. "She and I were wrong for each other from the beginning. We just needed a few years to be sure about it. She moved out of state. She's not in contact." He said it the way it was, a fact, not a wound being displayed. "Mia doesn't ask about her much anymore. She used to when she was 7, 8. She stopped around 9. "Why did she stop?" "I think she decided she had enough of what she needed." He looked at his truck keys. "Kids do that. They figure out what's sufficient." Victoria was quiet. There was something happening in her expression that he was learning to read. The slight tension at the edge of her jaw that appeared when something she heard was doing something to her she hadn't given it permission to do. "I should go," she said. "I have calls this afternoon." "On a Saturday?" "The Frankfurt partnership has a time difference." "Right." She started toward her car, which was a black sedan parked 3 rows over with her driver already behind the wheel. She got halfway there and turned back. "There's a building inspection dinner," she said. "The annual operations review. It's more of a working meal than anything social. The facilities management team is included this year." She stopped. "I'm telling you this because you'll receive the formal invitation from Marcus on Monday, and I didn't want it to seem like..." She stopped again. He waited. I wanted you to know it wasn't accidental, she said. He looked at her across 3 rows of snow-edged cars. Okay, he said. She nodded once, turned, and got into the sedan. He drove home in the particular quiet of a man who has too many thoughts and has decided not to pursue any of them until he's eaten something. Mutt. The operations review dinner was held on a Thursday evening in late January, in a private dining room on the 31st floor that Ethan had never been in before. He arrived in the same clothes he wore to the rare occasions that required something better than work clothes: dark trousers, a gray shirt, a jacket that fit him well because Mia had made him buy one that actually fit him 2 years ago. He was one of 11 people from facilities and building management, and they were outnumbered by engineering directors and department heads. And the whole thing had the particular energy of an event that was nominally social, but actually a performance of organizational hierarchy. Ethan sat where he was placed and talked to the people around him, which included a building systems engineer named Claire, who was genuinely interesting, and a department head whose name he forgot within 4 minutes. Victoria moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms, without waste, with purpose. And she did not come to his end of the table for the first hour, which he didn't expect her to, and would have been strange if she had. But twice across the room their eyes met in the incidental way that happens at dinners when you're peripherally aware of where someone is, and both times she looked away first, which he filed without drawing conclusions. After dinner, during the standing portion of the evening when conversations dispersed and reorganized, she materialized at his shoulder with 2 glasses of wine and offered him one. How are you finding it? She asked. Informative, he said. I didn't know what the engineering review committee did. Now you do. Now I do. He looked at her. You made sure I was invited. I told you I would. You told me it wasn't accidental. That's a little different. She looked at her wine. I wanted to see how you were in a room like this. She said it plainly, the way she said plainly the things she'd apparently decided to stop not saying. You're different than I expected. How so? Most people from the facilities side of the building are either invisible in a room like this or overcompensating. You're neither. She turned to look at him. You're just present. Where else would I be? She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood. Everywhere else, in my experience. Most people are somewhere else in their head during these things. I find people interesting, he said. Even in rooms I wasn't expecting to be in. Even this room? Especially this room, he said. It's where you're different. She went very still for a moment. It wasn't an uncomfortable stillness. It was the stillness of someone who has heard something and is processing it completely before responding. Different how? She said. He thought about how to say it accurately. Downstairs you're direct. In your office you're direct. Here you're... He searched for the word managed, like there's a layer of translation happening between what you think and what you say. The line between her brows deepened slightly. That's true of everyone in professional settings. More true of you than most, he said, which is interesting because in most of the conversations we've actually had, you're not managed at all. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Around them the room continued its noise and its performances. My father will be at the company anniversary event in March, she said, and the apparent non sequitur was not actually a non sequitur. He understood immediately that this was her version of an explanation for the management. He's no longer involved in operations, but he attends the annual events. It's a presence I account for. What's his name? Harlan Langford. She said it the way people say names that have weight in them. He built this company from a regional utility contract into what it is now. He's very aware of that. And of what you've done with it? Something shifted in her expression. Not hurt exactly, more the look of someone navigating a terrain they know well and are tired of knowing. He has opinions about how the company should be led. We share a name and a building. The rest is more complicated. He didn't press it. He'd learned that with Victoria, the things she said were just the visible part of what she meant, and pressing only made the visible part close. You mentioned my personnel file, he said. I did. What else was in it? She looked at him steadily. The February note about the governor valve. 3 other maintenance recommendations in the past 2 years that were logged and deferred. A performance review from Marcus that described you as, she paused, recalling it precisely. Quote, technically exceptional, underutilized, and apparently uninterested in advancement. He smiled a little at that. Marcus wrote that? He did. He never said that to me. He probably didn't think it was useful information from where you were standing. She tilted her head slightly. Is he wrong? About which part? Any of it. He thought about it genuinely. I'm not underutilized, he said. I'm used correctly. Those are different things. He paused. As for advancement, I know what I'm building. I said that. You said it in terms of Mia's stability. I'm asking about you, separate from her. The question sat between them. It was the kind of question that felt simple and wasn't, and he respected her enough to give it the time it deserved. When I was 23, he said, I had a very clear picture of what my life was supposed to look like. Engineering degree, design career, the whole arc. And then it didn't work out that way. And it took me a few years, and a kid, and a lot of cold basements to understand that the picture I'd had wasn't the point. He turned the glass in his hand. The point was doing work that mattered, knowing a system well enough to help it. That's available at every level of what I do. He looked at her. I don't think you can say the same thing from where you are. She went quiet for a moment. No, she said. I can't. It came out like something being set down after being carried a long time. He noticed. Does that bother you? He asked. Most days, no. She finished her wine. Some days, yes. She looked at the room, the department heads and their careful performances. My father made the company. I made it larger, and somewhere in the middle of that I stopped being sure which part was mine and which part was just continuation. He looked at her. She was looking at the room and not at him, which meant she'd said more than she meant to and was recalibrating. That's a real thing to say, he said quietly. She looked back at him. I'm not doing anything with it, he said. I'm just saying it's a real thing, not a managed thing. She held his gaze for a moment that was a beat longer than professional. Then she looked away again, and he could almost see her reassembling the layer of translation he'd described. Almost. I'm going to circulate, she said. Okay. She started to move, then stopped. It was becoming a pattern with her, these departures that didn't quite complete. The maintenance rotation schedule gets reviewed in March. I've asked operations to include a senior technician position with systems oversight responsibility. She didn't look at him. The description will be accurate. It won't be invented to accommodate anyone. But you should know the position exists. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. She moved away into the room. He told Mia about the position, because he told Mia most things that were actually decisions rather than just events. She listened to the description over breakfast on a Saturday morning, eating cereal with the focused inattention she deployed when she was actually paying close attention. Do you want it? She asked. I'm thinking about whether I want it. That's not the same as whether she wants you to have it. He looked at his coffee. I know. Do you want it separate from her? The 12-year-old had a gift for reducing questions to their load-bearing structure. He sat with it. Yeah, he said. Actually, yeah, I do. Then take it. She put her spoon down. The school thing and the robotics thing don't change with a senior position. It's still the same building. The hours might change. I'm 12, Dad. I'm not 8. She looked at him with the particular patience she adopted when she thought he was overcomplicating something. I don't need you to stay small to keep me safe. He sat with that for a longer moment. When did you figure that out? He asked. Around January 14th, she said, and returned to her cereal. Well, Victoria called him on a Sunday in mid-February. Not his work phone, his personal cell, which he'd given her for the Friday circuit review because her assistant hadn't been reachable and they'd needed to coordinate access to a restricted floor. She'd never used it outside of work hours before. He was in the kitchen attempting to improve his chicken. He answered on the second ring. I need to know something, she said. No preamble. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before, not quite controlled. Okay, he said. What do you actually want? Not from the job. Not from the senior position. A pause. I've been trying to figure out where the line is between what I'm doing because it's professionally reasonable and what I'm doing because... She stopped. He heard her exhale. I need to know if I'm reading this correctly. The chicken was forgotten. He set down the spatula and leaned against the counter. You're reading it correctly, he said. Silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable. The kind that has texture, that means something is being processed honestly. That complicates things, she said. I know. I'm your employer. I'm aware. My father will have specific opinions. I'm sure he will. Ethan. His name, just the name, said in the tone of someone using it to make something real. I'm not good at this. I want to be honest about that. You're being honest right now, he said. It took me 2 months to make a phone call. I've been doing repairs in your building for 4 years, he said. I didn't say anything either. She was quiet. He could hear the slight sound of her breathing and the ambient quiet of whatever room she was in. No background noise, which meant she was alone, which meant she'd gone somewhere private to make this call, which told him more than the words did. I don't know what I'm asking for, she said. I want you to know that I'm not asking for anything specific. I know, he said. Neither am I. Then what is this? He thought about it honestly. The start of finding out, he said. Another silence. When she spoke again, the quality of her voice was different. Not controlled, not managed, just present in the way she was present in the generator room that first morning, direct and unperformed. I'll see you Monday, she said. You'll see me Monday, he said. She hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, then picked up the spatula and turned his attention back to the chicken with more care than he usually brought to it. The sear, Mia had said. You're not getting enough color on it. He turned the heat up, listened for the sound it made when it hit the pan correctly, and waited. Outside the kitchen window, the February sky was going dark early the way February skies do, and the city was doing its usual thing, complicated, unglamorous, indifferent to the smaller events happening inside its buildings. Somewhere across town, a woman who ran a $2 billion company was sitting in a quiet room processing the fact that she had just said out loud to a man with oil-stained work gloves and a daughter who called her the generator lady that she didn't know what she was asking for. And somewhere in a modest apartment kitchen, a maintenance technician with a 12-year-old and a malfunctioning radio in his truck was learning to properly sear chicken and thinking about what the start of something looks like when it arrives without announcement. Wearing ordinary clothes, not perfect, not smooth, not the way you'd have written it yourself, but real, the way few things that matter actually are. The weeks that followed that Sunday phone call had a particular quality to them. Not dramatic, not transformed, but different in the way a room is different after someone has opened a window. Things were the same, and something had shifted, and both of those things were true at once. They were careful about it, not evasive. Careful, which is a different thing. Victoria didn't change how she addressed him in meetings or in corridors when other people were present. He didn't change how he reported to Marcus or how he moved through the building's daily work. But there were coffee cups left on his workbench that he hadn't asked for, and there were evenings when his personal cell showed a message, a question about a circuit specification, a note about a maintenance item she'd flagged, and once, just once, a photo of a technical drawing she'd been reviewing at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night with the single line, "Tell me this junction is fine." He'd looked at it for 30 seconds and replied, "It's fine." She'd sent back thank you and nothing more, and that exchange, which was entirely professional and almost entirely not, had made him sit with his phone for longer than he'd admit. He accepted the senior technician position in March. The paperwork went through HR and Marcus signed off, and Clifford Ames from operations sent a single-line congratulatory email, and nothing about it felt invented or accommodated. The role was real, the responsibilities were real, and Ethan slid into it with the ease of someone stepping into a job that had been the shape of what he was doing anyway, just acknowledged. Mia's reaction was, "Does it pay more?" "Some." "Good." She went back to her laptop. The company anniversary event was scheduled for the third Saturday of March, in the large ground floor atrium that was opened for events twice a year. Blackstone Energy's 40th anniversary, which meant Harlan Langford's founding of the company predated Victoria's birth. Ethan knew about the event because the maintenance team was involved in the setup. Additional power draws for the lighting rigs, temporary modifications to the ground floor climate system to handle 250 bodies in a space designed for 50. He'd been overseeing the prep work for a week. He knew Harlan would be there. Victoria had told him, back in January, the way you tell someone about weather approaching. Not to prepare them exactly, just to make sure they weren't surprised by it. He met Harlan Langford on the Thursday before the event, which he hadn't anticipated. He was on a ladder in the atrium, checking the additional circuit load on the temporary lighting feed when he heard footsteps on the marble floor below him. Decisive footsteps, the kind that expect to arrive somewhere and usually do. He looked down. The man was in his early 70s, built like someone who had been larger once and had settled into a more compact version of that. Silver hair, precisely cut. A dark suit that wasn't for the office. It was the suit a man wears when he wants to remind a room who he is without saying it. He was looking up at Ethan with the particular expression of someone encountering an element of a space they consider theirs that they haven't been introduced to. "Who are you, Set?" he said. Not rudely, just directly, the way powerful men ask questions when they don't expect not to be answered. Ethan Holloway, senior systems technician. He came down 2 rungs on the ladder. "I'm overseeing the power modifications for the event." Harlan looked at the ceiling rigging, then back at Ethan. "The lighting feeds are doubled from last year. The guest list is up 40%, standard load adjustment." Harlan made a sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement. He walked to the center of the atrium and looked up at the whole space with the proprietary attention of a man who built the building and hasn't stopped owning it in his mind. "You're new," he said. 4 years in the building, new to the senior position." "Who put you in?" "Operations review," Ethan said. "The position was created in January." Harlan looked at him with a sharpness that was still very much intact behind 70-odd years. "Victoria put you in." Ethan came down off the ladder. "The position went through the standard HR process." "That's not what I asked." He looked at the older man steadily. "Ms. Langford identified a gap in the building system's oversight function and advocated for the role." "Yes." Harlan studied him for a moment with the unhurried attention of someone who has spent decades reading rooms and people. "You're the one from the generator," he said. It wasn't a question, so he'd heard about it. 8 months after October, and Harlan Langford still knew the story. That told Ethan something about how closely Harlan tracked his daughter's professional world, or at least the anomalies in it. "Yes," Ethan said. "And the wager?" "Yes." Interesting decision on her part. He said it without warmth or particular coldness, a pure assessment. He turned back toward the atrium entrance, then stopped. "You'll be at the event Saturday?" "Part of the facilities oversight team, yes." Harlan looked at him one more time. "Enjoy the setup," he said, and walked out. Ethan stood in the empty atrium for a moment after he left, looking at the marble floor and the temporary lighting rigs, and the whole space that was being assembled for a celebration of something Harlan Langford had built. He thought about the way the old man had said Victoria put you in, not as a question about procedure, but as a statement about ownership, about who directed things and who was directed. He went back up the ladder and finished the load check. He told Victoria about the encounter that evening, briefly, by text. "Your father came to the atrium today." She replied after 11 minutes, "I know. He told me he met you." "What did he say?" "That you were direct." A pause, then, "He meant it as both a compliment and a problem." "I figured." Another pause, longer, then, "Saturday is going to be difficult. I want you to know that going in." He looked at that message for a moment. "I know," he typed back. "It's okay." Her reply was one word, "Ethan." He waited. "Just be careful." And then, before he could read into that too much, "Not for my sake. For yours." He can make things complicated for people. He understood what she was telling him, and he understood the layer she wasn't saying, that she was worried, and that the worry was not performed, and that it had taken her something to type it. "I'll be fine," he sent back. "Focus on Saturday." She didn't reply after that, which meant she was thinking, which meant she was probably not sleeping, which he'd learned was what Victoria did with problems. She carried them into the night and worked them until they were either solved or exhausted. The anniversary event was the kind of thing that Blackstone Energy did with the professionalism of an organization that understood its image. 243 people in the atrium on a Saturday evening, investors, partners, longtime clients, board members, and the senior employees who'd been invited as part of the company's internal celebration. The lighting rigs Ethan had installed filled the space with warm, even light that turned the marble floor amber. The catering was not excessive, but was precise. There was a small stage at the far end with a podium and two large displays running a timeline of the company's history. Ethan was working that evening, which meant he had a radio clipped to his jacket and a presence in the room that was both inside the event and adjacent to it. He was checking in with his team periodically, one technician managing the AV feeds, another monitoring the climate system load. And in between, he moved through the edges of the room in the particular way of someone doing a job at an event, present but not attending. He saw Harlan Langford immediately. The old man was near the front of the room with a cluster of men his own age and a few who were younger, and he moved through them with the ease of someone who had been the center of rooms for so long he no longer noticed it consciously. He saw Ethan once across the room and gave him nothing. Not acknowledgement, not hostility, just a slight, registering pause that might not have meant anything. Victoria appeared at 8 o'clock, after the initial reception period, and she worked the room in the way she worked rooms, efficient, engaged, present with each conversation without lingering in any of them. She was wearing something dark and clean-lined that Ethan had no vocabulary for beyond the fact that it suited her in a way that looked natural rather than assembled. He watched her navigate the space and thought about the phone call in February and the technical drawing at 9 on a Wednesday night and the parking lot in January snow. He did not go to her, and she did not come to him, which was the understanding they had. This room, these 243 people, was not where they were, what they were becoming. That was fine. He understood it, and he didn't resent it. What he didn't anticipate was Harlan. It happened at 8:45. Ethan had moved to the edge of the room near the service corridor to check in with his AV technician about a display lag on the timeline feed, and he was still near that corridor when he heard Harlan's voice behind him. Close, deliberate. "Mr. Holloway." He turned. Harlan was alone, which was unusual. The old man had been flanked for most of the evening. He was standing with his drink and his assessment expression, and this time there was no neutrality in it. He'd made a decision between Thursday and now. "Walk with me for a moment," he said. It was framed as a request and wasn't one. Ethan walked. They moved into the relative quiet of a corner alcove near the building's main entrance, out of the main room's noise, and Harlan stopped and turned. "I'll be direct," he said. "I prefer that," Ethan said. "You're involved with my daughter." There it was, not a question. "We've been building something," Ethan said, carefully. "She's the CEO of a $2 billion company." Harlan said it the way people say things they consider self-evident. "You're a maintenance technician." "Senior systems technician," Ethan said. Harlan looked at him. "A title she arranged." "A title the operations review supported through the standard process." He kept his voice even. "I understand why you see it the way you do, but the position is real and the work is real. I'm not questioning whether you're competent at your job." Harlan's voice was still measured. This was a man who had run boardrooms, who knew how to make devastation sound like reason. "I'm questioning what you think you're doing in my daughter's life. She has responsibilities she doesn't fully understand the weight of yet. This company, when I step back entirely, and I will, it passes to her completely. That's a specific life. It requires specific kinds of partnership." "Partnership," Ethan said, "meaning someone appropriate. Meaning someone who understands what she is." "I understand what she is better than you might assume." Harlan looked at him with the patience of a man who has outlasted many rooms. "She's told you things," he said. "You've had conversations that felt real. I'm sure they were real. She doesn't do anything halfway. But she's also 30 years old, and she has spent her entire career in a building I made, and sometimes what feels like choosing is just proximity, convenience." He paused. "I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because someone should." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the older man and tried to see past the armor of it, past the suit and the measured voice and the ownership, and found something he hadn't expected to find, not calculation. Worry. Real, old worry, the kind that had calcified into control because control was the only tool he knew. It didn't make what Harlan was doing acceptable, but it made it human. "I think you love your daughter," Ethan said, "and I think you've spent so long protecting her that you've stopped asking what she needs protection from." Harlan's jaw tightened. "What she's been building with me," Ethan continued, "isn't proximity. It's not convenience. She called me on a Sunday evening from a quiet room because she needed to say something out loud, and she'd been holding it for 2 months. That's not a woman being swept somewhere by accident." He looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to be comfortable with it. I'm just asking you to see it accurately." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. "You're very sure of yourself for a man in your position." "I know what the problem is, and I know how to address it," Ethan said. "That's been true my whole career. It's true here, too." Before Harlan could respond, they both heard it. A shift in the sound of the room, a subtle change in the ambient conversation that meant the program was about to begin. They were being pulled back. "We're not finished," Harlan said. "I know," Ethan said. They returned to the room separately. The formal program was brief: a company history presentation, remarks from the board chairman, and then Victoria at the podium. She spoke for 12 minutes. He stood near the back and watched her with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read the difference between the managed Victoria and the present one. And what he saw up there was a woman doing something genuinely skilled and not entirely comfortable, because the managed version and the present version were not fully resolved in each other yet. When the program ended and the room shifted back into reception mode, he found Marcus near the catering table and told him the AV team was wrapping their equipment. Marcus nodded and started talking about a building permit issue for the spring infrastructure review, and Ethan listened and responded and kept half his attention on the room behind him. He clocked the moment Harlan crossed to Victoria. It was 20 minutes after the program ended. He saw the old man move through the room with direction, not the ambient circulating he'd been doing, but intent, and arrive at Victoria's side during a conversation she was having with 2 board members. He said something that pulled her out of the conversation smoothly enough that it probably looked natural to the board members. He watched them from across the room. He couldn't hear. He watched Victoria's posture change, not collapse, but something tighten in it, a specific holding-on quality he recognized. He watched her glance once across the room and find him, briefly, and then look back at her father. He didn't move toward them. That was her space and her conversation, and inserting himself would have been exactly the wrong thing. What happened next, he saw from 30 feet away, and would understand fully only after. Harlan's voice rose, not shout level, but enough to reach the nearest cluster of guests, enough to create a small, horrible pocket of attention. He heard the word employee, and he heard position, and he heard, clearly and without ambiguity, the word fired. The room didn't stop. It was too big and too noisy for that. But the immediate radius of it paused, the way a room pauses when something ruptures its surface. Ethan set down his glass. He walked across the room at an ordinary pace because running would have made it worse. He reached the edge of the conversation just as Harlan was saying, with the precision of a man who had spent decades understanding where leverage lived. "You will end this, or I will end it for you. I have the board votes, and you know I have them, and if you make me use them, I will." Victoria was very still. The stillness that Ethan had learned to read, not calm, but a kind of compression, everything being held at enormous pressure under a surface that hadn't broken yet. "This isn't the place," she said quietly. "You made it this place," Harlan said. "You put him in this building, you gave him a title, you've been—" "Harlan," a board member nearby, trying to intervene through politeness. "Perhaps. This is a family matter," Harlan said, without looking at him. "I'll clear out my locker Monday," Ethan said. Everyone looked at him. Harlan, Victoria, the board member, the 4 or 5 people who had drifted close enough to hear. "I'm sorry," Harlan said. "If that's what resolves this cleanly, I'll go." He looked at Harlan directly. "I'm not here to destabilize her company or her position. I never was. If you need me gone to believe that, then Ethan, Victoria's voice. Not loud, just his name in the tone she'd used on that Sunday phone call. The real one. He looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Something past the control, past the management, past the compression. Something that had been held at pressure for so long it had finally decided that the holding was costing more than the release. Don't, she said. And then to the room, to the board member and the nearby guests, and to the ambient 20-something people in the immediate vicinity who were now definitely paying attention. My father doesn't have the board votes. He hasn't had an operational role in this company for 11 months, and his advisory position does not include personnel decisions or executive relationships. She turned to Harlan. You know this. Harlan's expression went through something. Victoria. I have built every metric this company has set for 4 years, she said. Her voice was even, not loud, which made it more difficult to dismiss. I have made every partnership call, every product decision, every infrastructure investment for 4 years. I have done it well. And I have done it while living exactly the life you designed for me, which is the life of someone who runs your company and nothing else. She paused. I'm telling you that's changing. The room had made its decision about pretending not to listen. You're going to embarrass yourself, Harlan said, and the word yourself landed the way it was meant to, not as prediction, but as threat. Possibly, she said. I've been embarrassed before. I was publicly kissed on the cheek in front of analysts from Frankfurt and Tokyo. I survived it. The faintest edge of something, not humor exactly, but related to it, crossed her voice. What I won't survive is continuing to need your approval to exist. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had outlasted rooms, and this room was not outlasting him in the way other rooms had, because the thing in front of him was not opposition, which he knew how to handle. It was his daughter, finished with something, and that he had less equipment for. He looked once at Ethan. The look contained everything he'd said in the alcove and some things he hadn't said, and it landed with the weight of all of it. Then he turned and walked toward the exit with the steadiness of a man determined to leave under his own power. The room restarted. Not all at once, in stages, conversations resuming, attention redirecting with the practiced discretion of people who had been raised not to acknowledge what they'd just seen. Victoria stood where she was for a moment. Her breathing was steady but controlled, and he recognized the effort in that. He stepped close enough to say quietly, "Are you okay?" "No," she said. "Not quite." I need 5 minutes, she said. "Just 5 minutes somewhere quiet." She looked at him. "Then I have to go back in." "The service corridor," he said. "Left past the catering station. There's a side room." She nodded. She walked that direction without looking like she was leaving, which was a skill he recognized as something she'd learned. He waited 2 minutes, then followed. The side room was a service space. Plain walls, a folding table, the ambient sound of the building's systems behind the walls, the familiar hum and tick of infrastructure. She was standing against the far wall with her eyes closed when he came in. He closed the door. She opened her eyes. "He's going to make this difficult," she said. "I know. He'll call board members tonight. He'll frame it as a leadership concern. He's very good at framing things." "What do you need to do before Monday?" She looked at him. The question, practical, direct, aimed at the actionable, seemed to land somewhere useful. "I need to talk to 2 specific board members before he does," she said. "Tonight, if possible." "Then that's what you do tonight. And then Monday I need to—" She stopped. She looked at him with the expression he associated with the Sunday call, the tire iron honesty of it. "I don't know what Monday looks like. I've been thinking about this moment for weeks, and I still don't know what it looks like after." "Neither do I," he said. She looked at him. "That doesn't bother you?" "Not really." He looked back at her. "I've done a lot of repairs on systems where I knew the diagnosis and not the full outcome. You fix what you can see. Then you see what's next." She was quiet for a moment. Then, without any particular announcement, she closed the distance between them and put her hand flat against the center of his chest. Not an embrace, not a performance, just a hand and what it meant. He stood still. He put his hand over hers briefly, and then she stepped back. "I need to make those calls," she said. "Go," he said. She went. He stood in the service room for a minute after she left, with the building's systems humming behind the walls. The climate control cycling, the lighting feeds running at load, the infrastructure of 40 floors doing its invisible, constant work. He'd spent 4 years understanding this building, its rhythms and its failures, and its hidden tolerances. He thought about the governor valve in February and the ice over in January and the junction boxes on floors 20 through 26, and he thought about a woman who had stood in a room full of investors and board members and said the word changing with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally stopped talking themselves out of something. He couldn't fix what happened next. He knew that. He could diagnose, and he could show up, and he could be steady in the way steady people are. Not invulnerable, not certain, but consistent. Present. The kind of thing that doesn't promise it won't break, but promises it won't run. That had to be enough for tonight. He straightened his jacket, clipped the radio back to his belt, and went back to work. The calls Victoria made that Saturday night bought her exactly what she'd hoped for, and nothing more. She reached 2 board members before Harlan reached them, and she was honest with both. Not strategic, not angled, honest, which was a choice she made deliberately because she'd spent years being strategic and was tired of how it felt. She told them that her father had made a scene at a company event over a personal matter that was not operationally relevant, and she told them she was informing them directly because she expected Harlan would call, and she wanted them to have her version first. Both of them were careful and professional in the way board members are careful and professional when they are privately deciding which way a situation will go. Neither of them committed to anything. She sat in her apartment at 11:30 that night with the calls finished and the quiet around her, and she understood that she had started something she couldn't finish in a weekend. That was fine. She'd always been better at the sustained work than the single decisive moment anyway. What she hadn't expected was that Harlan would move on Monday with the specific efficiency of a man who had been preparing longer than Saturday. By 10 o'clock Monday morning, 3 board members had requested a formal review of the new senior technician position, its creation process, its compensation, its reporting structure. By noon, the company's legal team had received an inquiry from Harlan's personal attorney regarding the operational independence of the advisory board and its influence over executive hiring decisions. By 2 o'clock, Ryan Cho was in Victoria's office with the door closed and the expression of a man who had absorbed several pieces of bad news and was trying to figure out the order in which to deliver them. "He's organized," Ryan said. "He's always been organized," Victoria said. She was standing at the window. "What's the board count?" 3 confirmed supportive of a review. 2 undecided. 4 haven't responded to his outreach. Ryan paused. "You have 2 who called me directly to say they're not interested in getting involved, which means they're staying out of it. Which means they're not protecting me either. Not actively, no." She turned from the window. "And the legal inquiry? Our general counsel says it has no standing. The advisory board's charter is explicitly non-operational. Harlan knows this. He helped write the charter." Ryan looked at her steadily. "This isn't about winning a legal argument. He's creating noise, enough noise that the board starts asking whether there's a leadership distraction." Victoria nodded. She'd known this was the shape of it before Ryan confirmed it. Harlan didn't fight with force, he fought with erosion. He created uncertainty and let other people's discomfort do the work. "Set up a full board meeting for Thursday," she said. "Not a review session, a regular quarterly performance meeting. I want it on the record that this company's Q1 numbers are strong, and the operational outlook is clean." She picked up her pen. "Then I'm going to talk to Harlan directly." Ryan looked at her. "Is that—" "I'm not asking for his blessing," she said. "I'm giving him the chance to stop this before it costs him something. There's a difference." She called Ethan that evening and told him what was happening in the way she'd learned to tell him things. Without performance, without the managed translation layer, just the facts and what she thought about them. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she'd stopped taking for granted, the particular quality of his listening, which was not passive. It was active in the way that certain tools are active when they're doing their job correctly, holding the weight of what they're carrying without strain. "What do you need from me?" he asked when she'd finished. "Nothing right now. I need to know you're not panicking. I'm not panicking. I know, she said. I needed to hear it. A pause. Victoria. Yeah. Whatever comes out of Thursday on the board meeting, the conversation with your father, I'm not going anywhere. I want that to be clear. She was quiet for a moment. Even if it gets complicated. It's already complicated. That's not new information. She sat with that. Outside her apartment window, the city was doing its nighttime business, and she thought about a Saturday evening 8 months ago when she'd gone down to a sub-level generator room for no professionally defensible reason and found a man in coveralls who looked at her without the usual arrangement of performance. She thought about how long it had taken her to understand that the thing she'd been so careful around was not a risk to be managed, but something she'd been starving for without knowing the name of it. Go to sleep, he said. Thursday's going to be a long day. I know. Good night, Victoria. Good night, she said, and the word in her own voice sounded different than it had for years. Less like an ending and more like a door left open. The conversation with Harlan happened on Wednesday afternoon in his home office in the house she'd grown up in, which she'd chosen deliberately because it was his territory, and she wanted him to know she wasn't afraid of his territory anymore. He was behind his desk when she arrived, which was also deliberate. The desk as position, the room as reminder of what he'd built and what that meant. She sat across from him without being invited to and put her hands flat on her knees and looked at him. I'm not here to fight, she said. Neither am I, he said. They looked at each other for a moment across 40 years of a specific and complicated relationship. You put 3 board members up to a review of a mid-level position that doesn't affect a single revenue line, she said. You engaged your personal attorney against your own company's charter. You did it within 48 hours of a public argument at an event I organized. She paused. If you'd done this to a competitor, I'd say it was an impressive response. As my father, I want you to understand how it feels. Harlan's expression didn't shift exactly, but something in it recalibrated. I did what I believed necessary. You did what you always do, she said. You saw something you didn't control, and you moved to control it. That's not unfair, he said, which surprised her. She looked at him. I know what you're afraid of, she said. You're afraid I'll lose focus. You're afraid I'll make decisions based on feeling rather than strategy, and that the company will suffer. I understand that fear. I've spent my entire career trying to make it irrational. She paused. But you're also afraid of something else. He waited. You're afraid, she said more quietly, that if I have a life separate from this company, I won't need you the way I've needed you. That the company has been the thing keeping us in the same room all these years, and without it as the whole of my identity, there's nothing you know how to give me. She watched his face. That's what Saturday was really about. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the silence of a negotiation, but the silence of something true being in the air between 2 people who don't usually let true things into the air between them. Harlan looked at the desk for a moment. When he looked back at her, he was older in his face than he'd been a minute ago. Not defeated, just less armored in the way armor comes off when someone names the thing underneath it accurately. He's not what I would have chosen for you, he said. I know. It's not about his job. You understand that. I'm starting to, she said. What is it about? Harlan was quiet for a moment. He's going to expect things from you that I don't know if you know how to give. He's going to want presence, the kind that doesn't get overridden by a board meeting or a product launch. He looked at her directly. You know what you're like when something needs building. You disappear into it. Every relationship in your life has come second to that. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. That might be true, she said. It might be something I have to work on. She looked at her father across the desk, across the distance of all the things they'd never said properly. But you don't get to make that decision for me, Dad, even if you're right about it. The word dad did something to him. She hadn't used it in years. Not consciously, she just hadn't. She'd been calling him Harlan in her head for so long it had migrated to her voice. She saw it land. I'll withdraw the board review request, he said, and the legal inquiry. Thank you. I'm not giving you my blessing, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for it, she said. I'm asking you to stay in my life. Those are different things. He looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who built things. That was who he was at the center of it. Builder, architect, founder. And maybe what he was looking at across this desk, in his daughter who had grown into something he recognized and didn't fully understand, was a thing he'd built that had become more than he'd planned for, and he was trying to figure out if that was loss or completion. "We'll see," he said. It wasn't much. It was more than nothing. She drove back to the city with the window down despite the cold, and she thought about the word see and decided it was enough to work with. The Thursday board meeting was thorough and unremarkable, which was exactly what she needed it to be. Q1 numbers were strong. The ClearGrid rollout was running ahead of schedule. The Frankfurt partnership had signed. She answered questions with the precision she'd spent 4 years building, and at the end of the meeting, the board chairman shook her hand and told her the company was in good shape, and 3 of the 5 board members who'd been approached by Harlan found reasons to speak to her individually in the hallway afterward, which told her the weather had changed. The review requests were formally withdrawn by Friday afternoon. She told Ethan that evening by text because she was in a post-meeting dinner she couldn't leave, and he replied with, "Good, eat something," which made her laugh in the middle of a conversation with the Frankfurt Consortium representative, and she had to turn it into a cough, and the representative looked at her with polite confusion, and she thought, this is what it feels like when something has changed. What happened in the months that followed was not a transformation. It was more like a slow correction, the kind of adjustment that happens when a system has been running slightly off balance for years, and someone finally recalibrates it. There were still board members who thought of the situation with varying degrees of skepticism. There were still industry journalists who wrote the story in the way journalists write stories about female executives and relationships, as distraction, as vulnerability, as something to be monitored. Victoria read 2 of those pieces and had exactly the response she expected to have, which was anger, and then she did what she always did with anger. She converted it into precision. She and Ethan did not make a public announcement because there was nothing to announce. They were 2 people building something in the space their daily lives allowed, which was sometimes enough and sometimes required negotiation and was never the clean, composed story anyone outside it would have written. They had dinners at his apartment where Mia corrected his cooking with the merciless accuracy of someone who had watched 4 seasons of competitive cooking shows and considered them reference material. They had evenings at her place where she worked and he read, and the particular comfort of that, of being in the same room with someone who didn't need you to perform, was something she hadn't known to want. They argued. Not dramatically. It wasn't that kind of relationship. They argued about things that mattered, about how much time she gave the company versus how much she held back for everything else, which was a real tension and didn't resolve quickly, about whether he should apply for the infrastructure director position that opened in July, which he ultimately didn't, and she ultimately understood why without entirely agreeing, about Mia, once, when Victoria offered to fund the state robotics competition travel, and Ethan said no, and she didn't immediately understand the reason, and he had to explain it twice. The second time, she understood. The funding came through the company's Youth STEM initiative instead, which was different, and Mia accepted it with the thoughtful practicality of a 13-year-old who knew the difference between a gift and a structure. The state championship was in April. Mia's team came in second. She stood with her trophy, larger than the regional one, since second place at state was more accomplished than first place at regional, and looked at it with an expression that was satisfied and dissatisfied in equal portions, which told Ethan she was already planning for next year. He stood with his hands in his pockets in the gymnasium bleachers and felt something that had no efficient name, not quite pride, which sounded too much like ownership, but something in that country. Victoria sat beside him. She didn't say anything. She'd learned, gradually and with some effort, that not everything required a response. She's going to want to debrief on the 3rd-round match for approximately 2 hours tonight, Ethan said. I know, Victoria said. I've been taking notes. He looked at her. She was holding her phone with a genuinely annotated document open, observations on the match, technical questions she'd generated during the competition. He stared at it. You've been taking notes, he said. She'll expect informed conversation, Victoria said, with a slight defensiveness that was actually the opposite. It was exposure, the small, revealing kind. The kind that happens when you've been caught caring about something you didn't expect to care about. I don't want to be the person who says, "Great job," and has nothing else. He looked at his phone, looked at her, looked at the gymnasium floor where Mia was with her teammates. "She's gonna like you," he said. "She already does. She just hasn't said it because she doesn't say things until she's sure. She told me last week that my chicken was better than yours." "She told you that?" She said, and I quote, "You actually let it rest before you cut it. My dad never lets it rest." He sat with that for a moment. "Traitor," he said without heat. Victoria smiled, the slow, unguarded one, the one she'd stopped trying to redirect. And he thought about October in a sub-level generator room, and a woman who'd stood in the doorway and said, "Defined situation," and had been, in every way that mattered, someone he had not expected to find in that building or anywhere else. The thing about unexpected things is that they arrive without preparation and leave you improvising, which is uncomfortable, and also, if you let it be, the closest thing to being alive that daily life usually allows. But in September, 11 months after the generator, Victoria resigned as CEO of Blackstone Energy. She didn't do it under pressure. Harlan had backed down from the board maneuvers in March, and the company's performance had given her no operational reason to leave, and no one was forcing her hand. She did it because she'd been thinking about something Ethan had said in the operations review dinner, the first time they'd stood together at the edge of a formal room. "I know what I'm building." She'd been turning that sentence over for months, testing it against herself, asking the question she'd never seriously asked. What was she building? Not what was she running or managing or growing. What was she actually building, with her own hands, that would be more than continuation? The answer took a long time to arrive. When it did, it was not grand. It was small and specific, the way real answers usually are. She wanted to build something that solved a problem she actually cared about. Not managed a problem, solved one. She told the board 4 weeks before the announcement, which gave them time to organize a competent succession, and she told Harlan 2 weeks before that, in the same home office where she'd told him she wasn't asking his blessing. He sat across the desk and listened without interrupting, which was the closest he could come to acceptance in his vocabulary, and when she finished, he said, "What are you going to build?" "I'm not sure yet," she said. "Something real." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not a plan," he said. "It's the start of one." He nodded. It wasn't endorsement. It was a man recognizing something in his daughter that he'd seen in himself 40 years ago, before he knew what it would become, and deciding not to argue with it. What it became, over the following year and a half, was a mid-size engineering firm called Clarity Infrastructure Solutions, a name that Ethan had suggested and Victoria had initially found too plain, and then had decided was right because it said exactly what it meant. The company's focus was energy infrastructure for underserved communities, rural grid modernization, affordable battery storage, the unglamorous but essential work of keeping power reliable in places that large utilities didn't find profitable enough to maintain properly. Ethan left Blackstone in January of the following year and became Clarity's operations director. Not because Victoria asked him to, but because when she described the work, he recognized in it something continuous with everything he'd been doing his whole career. The systems were the same, the scale was different. The reason felt, for the first time in his working life, precisely matched to what he was doing. They built it imperfectly, the way things get built. The first year was harder than either of them had projected. Contracts that fell through, a municipal partnership that dissolved 3 months in due to a city council vote they hadn't anticipated, a cash flow problem in August that required a difficult conversation with their lead investor. There were weeks when Victoria worked past midnight and Ethan covered the gap with Mia, and both of them were tired in the sustained way of people who have taken on more than is comfortable because they believe in what they're doing. They didn't always agree about the decisions. There was a month in the second year when they were genuinely struggling, not with each other, but with the accumulated weight of building something from nothing. And one evening, Ethan came home to find Victoria sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop closed and her hands flat on it, staring at nothing. "Tell me," he said. "I don't know if we can close the Millfield contract," she said. "The numbers don't work at the price they can pay." "Can we adjust the infrastructure spec?" "I've looked at it for 3 days." He sat down across from her. "Show me." She opened the laptop. They worked through it for 2 hours, and it was not romantic and it was not resolved that night, but somewhere in the third hour, when it was almost 11 and Mia had long since gone to bed and the kitchen table was covered in spec sheets, Victoria looked up and said, "The secondary conduit system. If we go with the modular option instead of integrated, the installation cost drops," he said. "But the maintenance overhead, I'll build the maintenance into the community partnership structure," he said. "Train local technicians. It's an asset, not a liability." She stared at him. Yeah, he said. She looked at the screen, looked at him. "We've been doing this long enough that you know the spec better than I do." "I've been doing this my whole life," he said. "The scale is different." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the honesty she'd stopped rationing, "I don't know how to tell you what this is like. Having someone who does this, who sits down and works the problem." "It's what we do," he said. "With each other," she said. "That's what I mean." He looked at her across the kitchen table, covered in spec sheets and untouched coffee cups, in the 11 o'clock kitchen of the life they'd been building for almost 2 years, and he thought about the word "with" and how long it had taken both of them to understand that it was the operative word. Not for someone, not in spite of someone, not alongside someone at a safe distance. With. The kind of with that required showing up on the bad weeks and not only the good ones. They closed the Millfield contract 6 weeks later with the modular spec and the community training structure, and it became the model they applied to 4 subsequent contracts over the following 18 months. By the time Mia was 15, she'd won 2 state robotics championships and been invited to a national qualifier in Boston. She was also, by that point, spending enough time at Clarity's office after school that the engineering team had quietly adopted her as an informal consultant on any project involving adaptive sensors, which was a thing that had happened organically and which nobody had arranged. She had opinions about the modular conduit spec that were technically sound and characteristically unsparing, and she delivered them with the directness of someone who had grown up in a household where directness was treated as the default rather than the exception. Victoria had become, over time, something in Mia's life that neither of them had a precise name for. It wasn't a replacement for something absent. Mia had never spent much energy on the absence, having decided at 9 that what she had was sufficient, but it was something additional and genuine. Victoria learned to let things rest before she cut them. Mia learned to give the initial draft an hour before deciding it was wrong. They argued sometimes, in the way people who respect each other's competence argue, with substance rather than noise, and made up without ceremony. Ethan watched this from the position of a man who had learned not to over-narrate the things that mattered. He'd spent years understanding that the most important processes were the ones you couldn't hear, the things running steadily behind the walls, the systems doing their work without announcement. This was like that, a family assembling from parts that hadn't been designed for each other, finding fit through use rather than specification, becoming something that worked. It was not perfect. Harlan came to Mia's second state championship and sat 3 rows behind them and did not speak to Ethan directly, but he brought a program that he'd had the presence to fold to the right page. And when Mia's team won, he stood and clapped with the rest of the gymnasium. And afterward, he walked down to the floor and said to his daughter, standing near the trophy table, "The sensor calibration on the final obstacle was very clean." Victoria looked at him. "She spent 3 weeks on it." "It shows," Harlan said. He looked at Mia, who was talking to her teammates nearby. He had the expression of a man who had not prepared a speech. "She's very serious about it." "She's serious about most things," Victoria said. "She gets that from her father." Victoria looked at him for a moment. Harlan had never said Ethan's name to her since March of the previous year. The referral, indirect, almost involuntary, was the closest he'd come to acknowledging the shape of what existed. "Yes," she said. "She does." Harlan nodded once and left. Victoria stood at the edge of the trophy table for a moment, in the gymnasium noise, and felt something she recognized as old and finally releasing, a held breath she'd been holding so long she'd stopped noticing it. She looked across the floor to where Ethan was helping a parent carry a equipment case toward the exit, doing it without being asked, the way he did most things. He saw her looking and raised an eyebrow in the question. Okay? She nodded, and she meant it completely. There is something people get wrong about fixing things. They think the fix is the moment, the spark, the restart, the system coming back online. They think the person who repairs something is the person who produces the dramatic event. But the people who spend their lives actually doing repair work, not the theoretical kind, not the managerial kind, but the hands-on, show up at 6 in the morning with a work lamp kind. They know it differently. They know the fix is just the correction of a deviation from what the system was always trying to do. You remove the blockage. You replace the degraded part. You reset the relay and restore the circuit. The system does the rest. It was built to run. You just gave it back the conditions to do so. Ethan had been doing that his whole life, in one form or another. In generators and cooling units and circuit junctions and underserved communities that needed reliable power and didn't have the infrastructure to maintain it. He understood, at a level below articulation, that the work was not about him. It was about restoring function to something that already had the capacity to work, if the accumulated damage could be cleared. He had not known, until Victoria, that this applied to people the same way. Not that people were machines, they weren't. They were considerably more frustrating and considerably more interesting. But the principle held. The capacity was there. What got in the way was usually old damage, and the adaptations built around old damage. The management layers and the controlled silences, and the way certain people learned to live without what they needed because needing it had cost them too much before. He couldn't repair that. Nobody could repair that for someone else. What you could do was show up and stay, and be the kind of steady presence that makes the conditions safe enough for the system to do the work itself. That was all. That was enough. He thought about this on an evening in late October, almost exactly 2 years after the generator, sitting on the front steps of the small house they'd been renting outside the city since the previous spring. The neighborhood was the kind that had probably been handsome 30 years ago and was now mostly functional and occasionally cheerful, with old trees that had outlasted the cosmetic cycles and a corner bakery that was not Instagram-worthy but made excellent coffee. He liked it, which told him something about how far he'd come from believing that what he provided was defined by its limitations. Mia was inside finishing homework. He could see her through the front window, the particular silhouette of her at the table, hunched slightly over the laptop, one hand moving her hair out of her face the way she did when she was focused. She'd grown 3 inches in the past year and had opinions about materials science that exceeded the curriculum by 2 grade levels, and had recently developed a habit of leaving robotics components in places that were not designed for robotics components. Victoria pulled into the driveway at 7:15, later than she'd planned because the investor call had run long, and she got out of the car with her bag over one shoulder and looked up at the house with the expression she had when she was still half in the workday and half out of it. He'd learned not to interrupt that transition, to give her the few minutes between car and door to finish arriving. She came up the steps and sat beside him instead of going in. She looked at the street, the old trees, the corner bakery's lights. "How was the call?" he asked. "Productive," she said. "The Millfield model is getting interest from a county in Tennessee. I think we can close it before December." "That's good." "Yeah." She was quiet. "How was your day?" "Drove out to the Lakeview site. The grid relay installation is ahead of schedule by 3 days." 3 days. She leaned back on her hands. "How'd you manage 3 days?" "The crew is very good," he said, "and I stayed out of their way." She looked at him. "You're better at that than you used to be." "I had a mediocre model early in my career," he said. "It helped me understand what not to do." She made the small sound that meant amusement without announcement, and he felt it in his chest the way he always did. Not dramatic, just warm. The warmth of something specific and earned. The front door opened and Mia appeared in the doorway with her laptop under her arm and the look of someone who had finished one thing and was ready to begin the next. "The sensor calibration specs for the Tennessee proposal are wrong," she said. Ethan looked at her. "I didn't know you'd read the Tennessee proposal." Victoria left it open on the kitchen table. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "The adaptive threshold setting assumes a continental climate," Mia continued. "Tennessee's going to have humidity variants that'll throw the readings in summer. You need to recalibrate for subtropical coastal range. Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Mia. She's right, Victoria said. I know she's right, Ethan said. You can fix it Monday, Mia said, with the tone of someone dismissing a problem she has already solved conceptually. Also, what's for dinner? Chicken, Ethan said. Mia looked at Victoria. You're cooking? I wasn't planning on it, Victoria said. Then I'll cook, Mia said, with the particular authority of someone who had decided 3 minutes ago that this was now her project, and disappeared back inside. Ethan and Victoria sat on the front steps in the October evening while the old trees did their leaf dropping and the bakery on the corner turned its lights up, and somewhere inside the house, a 15-year-old who had been to 2 state championships and was already planning her third began, with the focused competence she'd inherited from her father and extended into every corner of her life, to cook dinner for 3 people who had become, by no efficient or designed process, a family. Not the family anyone would have drawn up in advance. Not the clean, composed version of the story. The real one, with the deferred maintenance requests, and the difficult board meetings, and the arguments about chicken, and the sensor calibration errors, and the investor calls that ran long, with the old man who hadn't forgiven but had begun to stay in the room, with the space at the table for what wasn't said yet as much as for what was. The version that had been built the way things get built, when the people involved are more interested in something real than something perfect. 2 years ago today, Victoria said. He looked at her. Give or take a week. The generator. The governor valve, he said. She looked at the street for a moment. Do you know what I thought when I came down to that room, when I saw you? No. I thought you were too calm, she said. Everyone else was. There was panic, and you were just looking at the machine like it was a conversation. He thought about that. It was. I know that now. She looked at him. I thought it was arrogance. I didn't know yet that it was what you're like, when you know what you're doing. You made a ridiculous wager, he said. I make worse decisions than that routinely, she said. That one worked out. He looked at her. She was looking at the street, at the trees, at the October evening settling over the neighborhood, and she had the expression she had when she was actually present, not managed, not performing, not translating, just there. Yeah, he said. It did. Inside the house, Mia dropped something, a bowl, by the sound of it, and then said, with the particular tone of someone conducting a controlled incident assessment, I'm fine. Nothing broke. And then, after a pause, the chicken's going to be good. I'm letting it rest first. The corner bakery's lights came all the way up. The old trees moved in the wind. 2 people sat on the front steps of a house that had been built for someone else and become theirs through use, through showing up, through the ordinary work of being in the same place when it mattered, and let the evening do what evenings do. Hold everything that has happened and everything still to come in the particular suspension of a moment that knows it is, for now, enough. That was the whole of it. That was all of it. A woman who had run a billion-dollar company learning to let things rest before she cut them. A man who had spent his life fixing broken systems, understanding that the most important repair he'd ever made was the one he'd made to his own willingness to be found. A girl who had known since she was 9 that what she had was sufficient and had been right, and was even more right now. The machines run, the lights stay on, and sometimes, not always, not easily, not without the accumulated evidence of showing up, the broken things come back to life.